You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. Kate Reid has lived three very different lives. The first as an engineer who worked at the most elite level of Formula One car racing. The second as a young woman consumed by anorexia, to the point where she nearly died. And Kate Reid's third life is the one she's living now, as the owner of Australia's most famous bakery. It's called Lune, and it's actually a croissanterie. Lune croissants have been named the best in the world, which isn't bad for a Melbourne girl who doesn't even speak very good French. From Mamma Mia, you're listening to No Filter, and I'm Mia Freedman. You're probably thinking that an eating disorder and a career making pastry seem like a pretty big contradiction, and you'd be right about that. What you're about to hear, though, is how the lowest moments in Kate Reid's life led directly to where she is now, and how her anorexia and her ability to create food that can nurture and uplift people are absolutely linked. If you're not lucky enough to have experienced the intense joy of a Lune croissant, you've probably seen one on Instagram or on news stories, because Lune is the bakery in Melbourne where people line up for hours every morning to get their pastry fix, with queues stretching for blocks. There's one in Brisbane now too, and more coming around Australia. Lune make pretty special croissants, but that's not what this interview is about. It's about the story of a woman who thought her life was going to turn out one way when she landed the job of her dreams in the UK, and then sank to some pretty confronting depths on the way to saving her own life. Here's my conversation with Kate Reid. Kate, what did you love about working in Formula One? What was the best part about it?
I reckon the best part was the first week at Williams, before I really knew what it was like, and having all the things that I dreamt about coming true in such a short amount of time.
What had you dreamt about? How had you imagined it would be?
I'd imagined that it's a pretty affluent world, pretty excessive. And if you're an engineer that works in that world, I imagine that you realise that you are in a privileged situation, working with a lot of money on essentially life-size toy cars that race around the world. And for that privilege that you realise should come with how lucky am I? I'm going to have so much fun with this. I'm really going to push the boundaries of the technology that we're working with. I'm going to change the world in an exciting way with this toy car, and maybe one day it will affect the rest of the planet in a more commercial way.
So for most of us, our exposure to F1 is meow, meow. I say that because I've gone to sleep with those noises in my ear for many, many years. I've come from a family of F1 tragics. My father, my husband, both my sons. So, it's very glamorous. There's celebrities, there's drivers, there's excitement. When you're actually working on those cars, is that what your day-to-day is?
No, gosh, no. For me, the glamour wasn't the enticing part of Formula One. I was deeply obsessed with the technical nature of the cars. But no, in my role as an aerodynamicist, I worked 16 to 18 hours a day behind a computer, often going through a whole day without having conversation with people, a lot of negative applied stress in the office. You were lucky if you even got to watch the races with your team members. They didn't really even offer opportunity for us all to get together and watch races. So it was very much compartmentalised into you're responsible for this part of the car and you're just going to put your head down and do that, and actually not see the bigger picture, which is really important.
Well, I was going to say, I asked you what you loved about the job. What did you hate? And how soon did you start to hate it?
I think hate might be the wrong word. Realise that it wasn't suited to me. And then, therefore it came out in a negative way. Maybe it felt like hate at the time, but looking back on it, it's probably exactly the reality of what an engineer is. But I was just very deeply unaware of what that was going to translate to in reality. It was just very much not suited to me, and I probably realised it very early on, but I'd worked so hard for so long with such singular focus to get there that I probably pushed it subconsciously to the back of my mind, this thing that wasn't quite fitting right. Actually, the best way I can describe it is I felt like a little kid playing dress-ups, going into the office, wearing clothes that were a bit too big for me and didn't fit, and I didn't really know what to do in them.
Like Donald Trump being president.
That's exactly how I felt.
Like, how did someone let me do this job? Is it okay that I do this job?
The guys kept asking why I was talking in an American accent. So
you were the only woman.
I was the only woman. Yep.
In a team of how big?
So the team were 500 people, but there were other women working in non-technical roles, so human resources, marketing, hospitality.
Of course, grid girls.
Yep.
It's a pretty sexist industry, I would imagine.
Very.
Yeah.
Like actually, I was working at Ford the year before I went to work in F1. And when I told some of my colleagues at Ford that I was moving to the UK to work in Formula One, one of the girls I worked with said, "Oh my God, are you going to be a grid girl?"
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that was a girl working in a motor company, thinking that that's what my dream was. So even then, maybe it was wild for her to think that I would want to do something technical when being a woman in Formula One was being a grid girl. Also, I would have been a shocking grid girl. I don't have the legs for it.
And I've heard you say that you were paid the princely sum of £13,000, which is about, what, $25,000 a year for your 18-hour days?
Yep. And sometimes 7 days a week. Every 4 weeks we'd do a week of night shifts in the wind tunnel. It was a tiny sum of money.
Yeah.
But I guess if you love what you're doing, the money doesn't really matter. And maybe that realisation, when I started to realise that I wasn't happy, you start to be a little bit jaded about the fact that you're not being remunerated for your deep effort in something. But like, I mean, I think I've said this before as well, but the HR team told me that 3,000 CVs a week land on their desk. And you know that. Like there's the pressure on you that, well, you know, if you're not happy with the money and the hours.
Someone else will do that job in a heartbeat.
Yeah, 3,000 people are ready to jump into your seat. So they work on that pressure as well.
Why did you join a gym?
I was living and working with my partner. He had actually recommended that I move Formula One teams, and then we got together. By the way, him and I now have a really good relationship, but for a long time we didn't speak. More for that later. But we were living together. He had recommended I move to this new team. Then we got together. He said, "Oh, I've been waiting. I've liked you for a long time, but I didn't want to work with someone that I was dating." And 6 weeks after I started my new job, he told me that he had accepted a job at the same team and he was going to be my boss.
Ouch.
Yeah. And that team had one other girl working in a technical role who was also dating her boss. And I'd witnessed it in the office, how their relationship played out. And it was very much, couldn't be seen to be favouring her. So maybe he was a little bit harder on her than everybody else. And when my boyfriend joined the team, I was already in a pretty unhappy place, but it just went downhill from there. I had no female friends. We'd moved town to move to the new Formula One team. And one day he said to me, "Oh, I think you should join the local gym." I said, "Oh, how come?" And he went, "Well, it might be a good place for you to meet people." But he also said, "You could also tone up a little bit." Keeping in mind that the eating disorder wasn't out of body image issues, because never before in my life had I had an issue with the weight that I was at or how I looked. I didn't think I was remarkable, but it hadn't been something that had played over and over in my mind.
Up until that point, what had been your relationship with food and your body?
Loved food. Also was active, like did exercise, don't think I overate. My psychiatrist during recovery spoke about this thing called pre-morbid weight, which is the weight that if you don't stress about your body or what you eat or how much you exercise, but you're a generally healthy person, it's the weight that your body just settles at.
It's where it wants to be.
It's exactly where it wants to be.
Wow.
All the doctors have described that pre the eating disorder, I was at my pre-morbid weight.
So a healthy resting weight in a way that didn't require you to restrict yourself or in any way.
I'd never owned a set of scales.
And how old were you and what year was this?
This was 2007, so 25.
You were still a young woman who lived in the world
Yep.
and was exposed to all the images that we're all exposed to in the world. Did you have any sense of feeling inadequate about your body? Like, how did you feel when he said you could tone up a bit?
I was a bit offended. And I mean, up until that point in time, we'd had like a really healthy physical relationship as well. And, he constantly expressed to me that he thought I was attractive.
Yeah.
We'd expressed that we loved each other by this point. We were living together. So it was a serious relationship. I think I was surprised by the comment.
It was just one of those things that you've never forgotten and is very lodged in your mind.
It was like Lizzie Fox in year 7 telling me that I had thunder thighs. Like, that stuck with me.
That happened? That's a thing?
That happened.
Lizzie's a person?
Lizzie's a person, yep.
Okay, so you had the usual things that women in the world and girls in the world experience.
Yeah, but not enough to make me ever even think about restricting my food or how much I exercised. I just ate what I wanted and I exercised when I wanted, and I was generally happy.
So you joined the gym.
The idea was for me to make friends, but when you're depressed, you're not really in the mood for making friends. Like,
Did you know you were depressed?
No. The UK medical system is absolutely shocking. The depression went completely undiagnosed. Like, no one ever in the UK diagnosed that I had an issue. And I mean, the day that my boyfriend started work at the Formula One team when he was my boss, they threw a big party for him to celebrate him. He'd worked in this team before, so he was like the hero coming back. It was also my birthday, and no one in the office knew it was my birthday. And I reckon I had some sort of a mental health episode that day where I actually don't remember the day apart from showing up at work. But at some point, I was a few kilometres down the road and a woman who worked at a factory down there had found me. I don't know how I got there. I don't remember leaving the office. And she'd taken me into their like lunch room in the factory. The next thing I remember is just sitting having a cup of tea and like tears streaming down my face. I couldn't explain to her why I was upset. She called my boyfriend who came down the road and got me. But I mean, like, there's clearly something not right if behaviour like that's happening.
So this was around the time that you were unhappy. There was a lot going on. You didn't have family and friends who'd known you a really long time to say, hey, Kate, you're not yourself.
This was maybe like the May, June of 2007. In the March, my boyfriend and I had flown back to Australia for the Australian Grand Prix, and I had really, really deep thoughts about never returning to the UK. Like, I didn't want to get on the plane to come back. And I'm pretty sure I cried, and from when we took off in Melbourne until we were somewhere over Russia. Like, actually that's making – yeah, I didn't want to leave home. So mum and dad were worried about me then. So they knew that something was a bit off with me. But I actually, at that time, I'd made one female friend, not through the gym, through Formula One, who is to this day one of my closest friends still and one of the most incredible women I know. And she worked in marketing in Formula One, and she said, I reckon you need to get out of the engineering office. I know you love Formula One. There's a job going at my office. Do you want to come and join us? So it was a bit of a lifeline.
Yeah.
It probably wasn't enough of one, but I mean, it was better than staying where I was. So I came back from that trip to Australia, interviewed for the role, got offered it, and so moved out of the team. So it was one step improved not working with my boyfriend anymore and also not working in the engineering environment. But the level of pressure wasn't different whether you were an engineer or in marketing. I mean, Formula One is the most cutthroat environment, and no matter what role you work in, you're under the pump and people want your job. And yeah, but we were working crazy hours. I mean, we'd fly out to races. So by this stage, I was probably, living many people's dreams, flying to different races and doing corporate hospitality and Formula One activations. But I mean, we'd fly out on the Tuesday or Wednesday, and often you'd get 1 or 2 hours sleep because you were hosting guests, taking them out to dinner, meeting them at airports, getting up early to do God knows what. So you'd, work for 5 to 6 days at a Grand Prix weekend, and maybe over the course of the weekend, if you were lucky, get like 8 hours sleep. And then you'd fly back on the Monday morning and start prepping for the next race in 2 weeks' time. And when your mental health is already incredibly poor and you don't have a strong friendship base and your relationship's a little bit shaky, it's a disaster waiting to happen.
Exercise is often touted as something that can be really helpful for mental health. When was the point at which joining the gym, you can see looking back now, things tipped into a bit more toxic in terms of your relationship with the gym and exercise?
I reckon it was almost immediately.
Really?
Yeah. So I joined the gym and they weren't particularly careful about it. They had this 6-week program like get fit, lose weight, we're going to measure you. So
every gym I've ever joined has been that at the beginning.
It's really
because they want a
irresponsible.
baseline, and they do I don't know if they still do, but they used to do the calipers where they do the pinching your fat. They weigh you.
Yep.
They say, what are your goals? And of course, everybody usually says, I want to lose weight.
Yep.
And they almost always say you should lose weight because, of course, that's their business model. Is that what happened to you?
Yeah. So they measured me, they weighed me, they made me run on a treadmill to see what my cardio situation was, made me see how flexible I was. And they're like, okay, here's our baseline. Now, talking to an engineer who loves numbers and measurable results. And targets. And each week they also had a card that they gave you that just had some really generic information about calories on it. But not happy in my relationship, with friendships, with work, missing my family. But suddenly there was this very simple formula of going to the gym every day, doing what they told me. And I reckon within week 2, I was going to the gym 5 mornings a week. And it was, it was the UK. It's not particularly nice weather. So you're getting up and it's raining or it's cold, but getting up at 6 a.m. every morning and I remember like the cross trainer was my cardio thing. And I would just stand on it and watch the subtitles of the BBC News for an hour every morning, just going harder and harder if I could. And part of me, not a rational part, but part of me probably knew that it wasn't fun. It didn't feel good. It wasn't exercise that I enjoyed. But
it was like punishment?
Yep. Yes, exactly. It was like punishment.
Can I ask what size you were around that time?
Before I started going to the gym, I was between an 8 and a 10.
Okay, wow. Yeah. So you were already really small.
Yep.
You had a small body and you were making it smaller and everyone was saying you looked great.
Yep.
And that must have been intoxicating.
Well, it's that measurable reward, that feedback that you're getting from people. Yeah. And again, as an engineer, like I live for measurable progress and feedback.
Yes.
So
when did you start restricting what you ate?
Oh, as soon as they started handing out the calorie cards, because I'm like, I want to be good at this. And
I want to win.
Yeah, I want to be the best at this.
I want to win weight loss.
Yep. So I'd take that little card home and the card turned into like, oh, well, if they've given me that information about those foods, surely there must be more information about all foods. So I'd found all the websites that you could put in a weight. So I started weighing all my food and then calculating how many calories was in that. So going back to the gym, the feeling after being at the gym was euphoric. Like, oh, I dreaded that and I got through it, but I've done it. And like you've got that endorphin high anyway. And then I'd come home and I had this total ritual of weighing out every gram for my breakfast. And I'd do it slowly as well. And I guess that's probably interacting with the food without having to eat it. And then you prepare this tiny cereal, where every single gram of milk and fruit and whatever you've put in has been weighed, recorded in a book. So later when I'm at work, I can calculate the calories in it and then put it in with the amount of exercise that I'd done. It's like literally I started to treat my body like the Formula One car.
And it sounds like you literally clicked into that very fast.
Very.
And the madness took you very fast.
Yep. Well, I mean, I think I probably joined the gym in about the July and I went home again to Australia for Christmas that year. Actually, maybe it was the month before Christmas. And Mum and Dad were worried about me by then. And I think at that stage I'd lost about 4 kilos. And like genuinely I thought I just looked great. Like I probably never looked slimmer and just more fit in my life. I'm like, why can't everyone see that I just look great? But without me knowing, my boyfriend had spoken to Mum and Dad on that holiday and expressed that he was a bit concerned about me because obviously he'd witnessed behavioural changes at home as well.
What had he seen?
Big mood swings. I wouldn't eat out anymore. I wouldn't go to restaurants because God knows what they've cooked the food in. Like, at home I'd weigh and measure the olive oil that was used in dishes so I was comfortable to eat it. But as soon as that control was taken out of my hands, I'd freak out. And he had started packing my lunch for me and he started requesting that we meet to have lunch together.
So he started packing your lunch because he was worried that you weren't eating enough?
Yep. He also nicknamed me his little Japanese prisoner of war
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Because you were starting to look emaciated.
Yep.
Okay.
So I think there was a point between when he'd recommended I join the gym.
Yeah.
And
careful what you wish for, buddy.
Yep. And
Yeah.
so then he's like, hey, why don't I put a banana in this muesli bar in your lunchbox today? And he's like, you can have that as a morning snack. And I'd get to work and put it in the bin. But then I'd meet him and I'd prepared salads for us. So we'd sit and eat our salad in the car together. He'd thought that I'd eaten the banana and muesli bar, but I hadn't. There was only one woman that worked not in my office, but in the same building. The office was actually at Silverstone Circuit, where the British Grand Prix is held. And I'd meet her in the morning. I'd go and get myself a cup of boiling water. That was my treat. And I'd meet her, and I think she started to see the decline, and she only recognised it because she too had had, I think, long suffering with an eating disorder and maybe just keeping it at bay. But she spotted it, and she was the only one brave enough to call it out.
What did she say?
She actually wrote me a letter, and maybe because she knew that confronting me about it might not yield great results, potentially because she'd experienced it herself. And she just said, look, I'm really worried about you. Her husband worked with her, so I knew him too. He's really worried about you too. You've lost what beautiful curves you did have. You just don't seem to be your normal bubbly self. We're really concerned. So
how did you react?
I don't think I was particularly receptive. Also, now we're at the point where my memory is honestly quite hazy about this point in my life.
Because you were malnourished.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like your brain is one of the organs that needs nutrition and food as well. And I wasn't just starving my butt and my thighs and my stomach. I was starving all my vital organs. So, yeah, my memory isn't – Mum will sometimes say, oh, remember when that happened? I'm like, no. What? Did that happen? She's like, oh my gosh, Kate, we were so worried about you. But yeah, these stories pop up all the time of things that happened that someone in their right mind should remember because they're shocking enough, and I just don't.
After the break, you're going to hear about the moment Kate's boyfriend had to call for help and what happened when she got back to Australia. At what point did your boyfriend ring your parents and say, I can't deal with this anymore, she needs to go home?
So we'd been to Australia for Christmas 2007, and May 2008 I flew to Barcelona for the Spanish Grand Prix working with the marketing company, and I was so unwell, like lightheaded. I definitely didn't have the energy required. I know people were raising their eyebrows in the office by this stage, but they still let me go to the event.
Because you looked so unwell?
Yeah. And also, I mean, the head of the office pulled me aside just before I went back to Australia and said, because we had a meeting talking about them putting me on 3 months of, I guess, personal leave for health, where they would hold my job for me. And she's like, honestly, your concentration's been lacking the last few months. You haven't been doing your work as well. I've noticed your decline. Thinking, why didn't you say something? Like, now as an employer, I pride myself on caring about the physical and mental health of my staff and prioritising that. Because if they're happy in their job and they're healthy, they're also going to give their best.
But how do you know? Like, it's a very personal thing to be able to say, hey, are you eating enough? I mean, I've worked with young women all my life, and I also can see the signs, but it's very rare that someone would appreciate an intervention by their boss, and also you have no proof. So when you were talking to your bosses about it, at what point did you become aware that you had an eating disorder?
Oh, I still didn't think I did.
What did you think?
I don't think I was thinking anymore. I think.
But when people said, we're worried about you, you're not concentrating, will you come out to dinner?
I didn't care about that stuff anymore. Like, my whole world was so narrow. All I cared about was the eating and the exercise, and everything else was just superfluous to that. So, you know, when my boyfriend was complaining that, you know, we couldn't go out to dinner or go hang out with friends anymore, I just didn't care anymore. I lost the ability to care about things that I'd once cared about.
Because you were so myopic in your focus.
Yep.
About getting thinner. Like, were you still working towards a goal?
Yeah. Like,
right.
The number on the scales just had to be less every day.
So there wasn't an end point.
No.
You just had to keep going down. And did you think, well, hang on, if they do keep going down, eventually I'll die?
No, that hadn't crossed my mind.
Right.
But keeping in mind, this was all happening in the UK still, where I really didn't have a support network. And I was so separated from mum and dad. Like, they would probably have intervened had it happened in Australia. And I mean, my boyfriend was my age. We were just kids, and he was so out of his depth. And he was also, keeping in mind, he was working in his dream job and he was loving it. Like, he'd worked just as hard as I had to get there. And the fact that he was succeeding in it and loving it, and it was something that he'd worked his whole life towards, and suddenly he was having to manage a girlfriend that he could see was slipping drastically with her health. Like, he wasn't qualified to manage that.
No.
And I think only hindsight's made me really look back.
With compassion to him, that he did the best he could with the limited tools that he had.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've communicated about that since, that like, I had a real revelation in 2018 when I wrote the first ever publicised piece about the eating disorder for Gourmet Traveller. And writing that, I really started to see it more on his perspective, how hard it would have been for him. And I'd never acknowledged that before. And he told me he didn't want to ever speak to me again, but I reached out to him and I said, you don't have to reply to this. But in hindsight now, I can see how deeply troubling it would have been for you, and to expect you to leave your career and all of this. We just had a real moment where we exchanged apologies on how we messed up with each other. So it was kids trying to navigate something that was like well beyond them without any support, really.
Your dad came and packed up your life in 2 days. Do you remember those days and whether you fought against the idea of going back to Australia or leaving your partner, or whether you were just quite passive and let it all happen around you?
No, I was so relieved. Like, the decision had been taken out of my hands, and like, I'm really close to my dad. So knowing that he was essentially going to come and rescue me, and that whatever was on the other side of it had to be better than where I was now. And like, I mean, I wanted to go back to Australia and carry on with the restricted eating and the exercise. It wasn't my goal to go back to Australia and just be normal.
Get well.
But like...
Well, you thought you were well.
Yeah.
You thought everybody else was overreacting or...
Yeah. I just thought the grass was going to be greener in Australia, and it would feel better. So
I shouldn't keep asking you in some ways what you were thinking, as if you should have been thinking differently, because as you say, part of anorexia is starving your brain.
Yeah.
And your brain works in very specific ways when it's starving. It can't think, it can't make good decisions. But conversely, well, not conversely, for survival, it makes you obsessively think about food.
Yeah. That's the body doing the mechanism that it needs to, but it's also torture.
It's very clever. I mean, it's designed to make you go and look for food under all circumstances, but when you can override it with an eating disorder, that's when it becomes torturous.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know I've spoken about this in the past too, but cooking and baking became my way of living vicariously, like managing that never-ending thought about food in my head. If I was thinking about what I was going to make, if I was walking down the aisles of the supermarket contemplating the ingredients, when I was at home in the kitchen preparing it and cooking it, all of those experiences were me engaging with food and letting my brain think about food without eating it. And I don't think that that's unique or unusual to me. I think it's incredibly common for people with eating disorders to think the same as me.
There are people with anorexia who get so in their head that they become convinced that they can inhale calories and that there are calories coming under the door and that there are calories in the air. Was that something, you know, in the preparation of food and being around food, was that a place that you ever went? I mean, I imagine you couldn't taste anything you were cooking.
I certainly didn't taste, but no, I didn't feel like being around the food or working with it was a concern to me. Not quite as drastic, but I do remember even feeling nervous about drinking water. And in particular, I wouldn't drink any water in the morning before I weighed myself. I was actually thinking about this the other day. I know a lot of people who suffer from eating disorders, when they've got an appointment with their psychiatrist, they'll drink a lot of water to fake their weight. I couldn't even do that. I had to walk into the psychiatrist's office and stand on her scales, because if I looked at the number and it was more, it would send me into a frenzy. So I couldn't even fake it for the psychiatrist.
Yeah.
I needed to see the lowest number possible at any time I stood on a scale.
Otherwise it was intolerable.
Yeah, like I would torture myself. And Mum tells me that some of my worst periods of time, even in the middle of winter, after dinner, I would just go out walking the streets for hours to walk off the calories of whatever I'd been made to eat for dinner.
I've seen anorexics doing that and it's very distressing to watch.
I have seen it now too, and it's very distressing.
Yeah. And what's it like in the head of that person?
Oh, Dad told me that when I was at my worst, I wouldn't even look before I crossed a road. I was that singularly focused on the movement and the exercise. It must be again, I don't have a real recollection of what I was thinking at the time, but it's just if you're moving, you're not eating. And if you're moving, you're burning calories. And it just becomes singular.
When you came home, what sort of care did you get? You moved home with your parents.
Oh, Mum and Dad are the greatest humans of all time.
They love you. You're their little girl.
Yeah. It really affected them. I think, I can't speak for Dad because he doesn't show his emotion as much as Mum, but I think it really, really affected Mum. And I mean, it's hard, and I haven't really ever spoken to Mum about this, but I wonder if she started to take on some of the behaviours, because I was just in control. I had to cook the meals. I had to prep my own food. So they were eating what I was eating.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that idea of not trusting anyone else to cook for you, what was it that you didn't trust?
Oh, that they were going to sneak calories in there that I wouldn't know about.
And you needed to control and know every single calorie
Yep.
that you consumed.
Yeah.
Because anorexia is about control.
That's
obsessive control.
And I think, bless Dad, both Mum and Dad managed it in the best way they possibly could. But first of all, support isn't great out there for families who have a member suffering from anorexia. And I think, again, the difference between men and women, I think a lot of men think the problem is just food. Yeah. And we'll get food into her and she'll be fine. And Mum somehow intrinsically understood that it wasn't about the food, that there was a deeper problem that needed to be addressed. So I think Dad probably found it frustrating, and Mum understood the real severity of the issue, that it wasn't actually just about feeding me. It was, so it's...
So would he, the usual just eat a burger? I don't understand.
Yeah.
And to someone who doesn't understand eating disorders or who's never had one, it seems so logical. It's like someone who's banging their head against a wall and complaining about it will just stop doing that.
Just eat.
And it will be okay. Just eat and you won't be anorexic anymore. Literally, you have the power.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I mean, this is winding the clock forward quite a bit, but people with an eating disorder are some of the strongest people in the world, because if they have the mental ability to stop themselves from something that's a life force, food, we need food. And food can be delicious as well. If we have this ability to tell our brains that we don't need it, we've also got the ability to get out of it. If you've got that mental strength to stop yourself from doing something that's so natural, you've also got the ability to turn it around. But it's getting yourself into a mindset where that feels like a positive thing rather than a negative thing.
Kate, what did you see when you looked in the mirror during your anorexia?
Oh, just someone overweight, clear body dysmorphia. I remember one afternoon going to my auntie's house, and when you sit down, when you've got jeans on your thighs, the meat and the muscles on your thighs spread out. I remember sitting there and clenching my stick-thin legs as tight as I could, because I couldn't bear how much my thighs were spreading sitting down.
So the feeling of your own flesh was repulsive to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
And distressing to you?
Yep. And I think that's probably why there was no end goal. The number just had to be smaller.
It was just part of you imagine maybe that you would be satisfied at some point, or that you would get to the point where your thighs didn't feel like they were spreading, or where you felt comfortable. again?
I don't ever think I imagined an end goal. But it's funny, like everything I do in life, I'm going to use croissants as an example.
Yeah.
Like people regularly say, you know, do you think you're making the perfect croissant? Like, absolutely not. I don't think perfection is something that is ever achieved. Therefore, it's the perfect goal because you'll continually be able
Iterating.
to be, and you're working towards it without ever actually getting there. So maybe I applied the same thing inadvertently with the eating disorder, that I didn't ever think there was an end goal. Just the goal was
better than today.
Correct. Yeah.
What did you think when you looked at other women's bodies? Be honest.
I can be pretty critical. I actually think through this, I think I've realised that I can be quite a judgmental person. But I don't remember in that period of being unwell ever looking at other people or judging them. Like, you become so insular. Like,
so the body dysmorphia applies to you, but it doesn't apply, like you thought you were fat, but you didn't necessarily think that everybody else was fat, even though they were technically much, much larger than you were at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So it was a specific lens that you had on yourself that was distorted.
But I mean, I don't know if you'd agree with me on this, but an eating disorder is intrinsically incredibly selfish. You become all about you.
Yes.
And
I would agree with that.
You're just always looking inward. You're not really thinking about how your actions are affecting other people, to the point where you're also just not even looking at other people anymore.
Yeah.
And you don't form an opinion about other people, because the only one that really matters is the opinion you have about yourself. So it becomes very inward looking.
And it's true. It's like you look back at things now that are so embarrassing or shameful that you did, or that other people said to you or observed in you. And at the time, it just brushes over you. I remember being a waitress and getting sacked because I was binging on the food when I was meant to be serving it, and throwing up during service. And like, how mortifying that I got fired for that. But at the time, I just remember it didn't even register.
Do you know, I didn't have an experience like that. I think I felt like I'd successfully pulled the wool over the world's eyes.
Yeah.
Like, I landed back in the country a shade over 40 kilos, and I applied for a job at a bakery in Armidale. I got full-time working on the counter starting at 6 a.m. and they gave me the job.
But why did you apply for a bakery? For that reason, you wanted to be around food.
Yep.
All you could think about was food. You knew you had the self-control, unlike someone who had bulimia perhaps.
Yeah, but sometimes I didn't. Like, there were odd occasions where temptation would overcome me. I remember being in one of the branches of the bakery down in Brighton on like a guest shift one day, and they'd put samples of stuff out and they'd put their brownie out. And once I'd had a taste, I had to have a few more. And I got home from work that day and Mum said I had a full-blown panic attack. And like, I wouldn't eat dinner. They couldn't console me. I started walking the streets. So, yeah, there were moments where my temptation, or probably just the need to eat, I gave into it.
It's not even the temptation. It's like survival. Your body's like, oh, thank God, we've got her to swallow something.
Yeah. But I mean, even that action, giving someone a job that looks so unwell without even questioning. I don't know why I decided to do this, but deep in my recovery, where I hadn't put any weight on yet, I decided to apply for a job as an air hostess with Qantas. And I didn't tell Mum and Dad. The interview was in New Zealand. So I booked a flight one day. I was living with them at the time, not even well enough to move out. And one day I said, I'm going to New Zealand for the weekend, because I was an adult and I could do whatever I wanted. They couldn't tell me. They were mortified. It was a 2-day recruitment process, and like at each stage of the recruitment process you could be sent home. But I made it through the whole weekend, and then at the end they said, there's just a couple more stages. A psychologist is going to talk to you over the phone. We're going to get you to do an online test, and finally, if you make it through those two, you'll have to have a medical. Made it through the psychology test, 40 kilos.
Did you have to lie?
No.
To the psychologist?
No. No.
Okay.
Made it through the online psychology test. Was freaking out about the medical. I'm like, my BMI is like 12.
Yeah.
You know, this is going to be an issue. They didn't blink an eye at the BMI of 12. They offered me the job.
What's a normal healthy BMI for a woman?
I think it's like 20 to 25.
Okay.
18 to 20 underweight.
And so I imagine you looked skeletal.
Yeah, like sunken
And they
face.
offered you the job.
They offered me the job. Now, surely there's a level of care, not just to me, but if they put me up in the air looking after people on a plane and like one of my vital organs crashes, I'm looking after all the people there and they're probably going to have to land the plane as an emergency.
Wow.
So, I mean, I felt like I was winning.
So did you take that job?
I did not. I had to have my gallbladder removed to get the job because I'd been having attacks and like
Anorexia related?
Well, they'd started before I had anorexia, but then I had an inflamed gallbladder. But then when you cut all the fat out of your diet, the fat is the thing that causes the attack. So I'd stopped having them. And then when I started to see a dietitian, like she'd sent me home one afternoon and said, your challenge is to have Ryvita with cheese on it. So I'd cut the 2 thinnest slices of cheese and put them on 2 dry Ryvitas and I had an attack. The fat from the cheese caused it. Mum came home from work and I'm in the fetal position on the ground, was rushed to hospital emergency. The doctor was like, she's got an inflamed gallbladder that needs to come out. Or she could manage it by diet. And I'm like, well, I'm not having an operation. So it was an excuse for me to restrict still. But then in the medical for the air hostess job, that came up. And it wasn't my BMI or my weight or anything else. They're like, oh, well, if you've got an inflamed gallbladder, you're going to have that removed to get the job. So I went into hospital, had it removed, and then I turned the job down.
Why?
I think it was just the thrill of the chase. I just wanted to know that I could get it. And then the reality of like, I don't want to serve people in the air. What am I thinking?
Yeah.
And also it wasn't exactly what I wanted. Like I knew I wanted to be baking and doing that job, that wasn't going to float my boat.
I've heard you speak very movingly about why you love baking. Can you explain it to people who might not understand why baking is the part of cooking that you enjoy so much?
Well, I think baking's very different to cooking. Cooking is incredibly intuitive and it's a process that you can be experimental with while you're doing it.
And it's not precise, is it? It's like,
exactly.
That's why I can't do it. Like a splash of this and a bit of that. I'm like, but how much?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am that person. I'm like, but how much? You know, is it a tablespoon or 10 grams or like.
Okay, so it's science. You like baking because baking is the most scientific part of cooking.
But it's like there's one step further. Like say you're making a stir fry for dinner and you're chopping up your capsicum and your mushrooms and maybe a bit of broccoli and all of those ingredients. I mean, even if it's a beef stir fry, you can like sometimes now I nibble on beef when it's raw. I mean, steak tartare is one of my favourite things. But like you can nibble on all those ingredients as you go.
Yeah.
When you're baking, when you look at the ingredients lined up on the bench in front of you, flour, sugar, eggs, milk. Well, milk's a different story.
Not so good for nibbling, the flour and the eggs and the butter.
Well, they're totally inedible. Yeah. Like they're not delicious. And if you follow the recipe exactly and you weigh out everything correctly and you use the methodology as described, you put something in the oven and what you pull out is so much more than the sum of the ingredients that you saw in front of you at the start. And
it's magic.
It's magic. It's magic and science. And the magical part of it for me is those lineup of raw ingredients that were inedible create something that genuinely brings joy to people. Like you don't really see anyone ever giggling with joy over a stir fry unless it's maybe like the best in the world.
Still not.
A random chocolate cake that, you know, someone's aunt made, I'll still have like a little inner child giggle about that.
Yeah.
Because it's just delicious.
Birthday cake's my favourite food.
Same.
Yeah.
Why can't we have it all the time?
Exactly. And also it's no accident, I imagine, that at one point with your psychologist you were talking about they asked you to write down all the rules you follow. And you went, oh, I don't have any rules. And then did it turn out that you had some rules?
Oh, I reckon I got to like 5 A4 pages. I think once I had one example of a rule. Like, if I've eaten this type of food for breakfast, I'm not allowed to have that type of food again during the day. Or, do you know what? It's hard to remember all the rules now.
I imagine a lot of foods, I know for me, there were foods I would allow myself to digest and foods I wouldn't. And most foods I wouldn't.
Yeah.
And then there were some foods that were the foods that I would want to binge on, and they were exclusively binge foods. And I would never, I could never have safe amounts of them.
Yep.
And allow myself to digest them.
Wow.
Yeah. And funnily enough, because I've been thinking about the croissants, when I was recovering from my eating disorder and over years I had to reintroduce things into my diet because it became very important that I didn't deny myself anything, because for bulimia, that obsession kicks in as well because you're in starving and binging and purging mode. The things that I obsessed over were the things that I wouldn't allow myself to have.
Yeah.
So I knew that it was dangerous for me to have any restrictions. I'd also lost my taste for things, but it took a while for things to come back. And one of the last things that ever came back for me was croissants.
Really?
Because it is one of the most calorie-dense, rich foods you can have.
Yeah.
And that, I was like, fascinating that the woman with anorexia decided that she was going to obsess on the croissant. Not a coincidence, I imagine.
Not at all. I mean, like you just said, when I was at my hungriest, I didn't dream about that stir fry. You dream about the thing that you obsess over, that you love, that you crave. And for me, that's always been baked goods.
What's forbidden?
Yeah. When I was in recovery, I was seeing a dietitian and she said, so I had to have breakfast, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, dessert, minimum of 6 meals a day. And for me, the two that were standout were morning and afternoon tea. And I'd be allowed at 1 milk coffee, this me allowing myself.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure they would have allowed as many as I wanted, and 1 baked good treat. And I would hang out, like, interestingly in recovery, I would hang out for those 2 times a day. And she's like, don't look at it as a food that you can't have. It's medicine right now. It's calorie dense.
Muffin medicine.
I was obsessed with muffins.
Yeah.
I actually
because muffins are, in a quote mark, healthy way to eat cake.
I can't believe I'm admitting this, but when I was in recovery, I started a blog called Muffin Else Matters.
Oh, I love it.
And I'd go around to different cafes and I was obsessed with trying their muffins. But there's a private eating disorder clinic in Melbourne that my psychiatrist convinced me to do a day program at, because her and I were at loggerheads. If I dropped below 40 kilos, she was going to commit me against my will. But I bargained with her and I was like, how about if I go along to a day program? I lasted like 5 days because I'm like, all these people have a problem. I don't have a problem. I don't understand why I'm here.
Did you listen to them and look at them and what did you think?
Oh, I'm like, oh, they've got a problem. I don't understand why I'm here.
How did you see them as different to you?
Some of them were kids. I'm like, oh, it's a body image issue. I don't have a body image issue. I'm fine. I was definitely the oldest one in the group, maybe by about 6 or 7 years. And I'm like, well, I got through my teens without an eating disorder. I've got this. But
what did you think you had?
Honestly, like, I still, maybe part of me was still in denial that I was okay.
Oh, completely. Well, sounds like all of you is in denial.
Yeah.
When did you accept that you had anorexia?
I had a really rocky relationship with my psychiatrist. I thought she had no respect for me. I'm like, I'm a woman of the world. I've worked in Formula One, something that not many people in the world ever achieve. I'm an adult and I know myself. You think I've got a problem and you don't respect the fact that I'm an adult. I think at some point we reached an understanding, and maybe it was me just finally coming around. I actually think at some point I felt like she started to show me respect for things that I had achieved in my life. It wasn't necessarily acknowledging the eating disorder. It was acknowledging the successes and the hard work that I'd done in other areas to get to certain points in my life. And then at some point we reached this understanding of mutual respect. And at that point in time, I think I acknowledged that I needed to get out of it.
That's so interesting that you imagined that the two things were mutually exclusive, that if you had an eating disorder, it must have meant that your life was a fuck up. And you were like, no, but here's the proof that my life isn't a fuck up, which therefore means I don't have anorexia because I achieved all these things. And if I had anorexia, I couldn't have. Was your...
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
And I mean, also in my head, every morning that I stood on the scales and I was a bit lighter, I was achieving what I'd set out to achieve. So that was a win for me, but everyone else was seeing it as a negative. And I'm like, but hang on, I'm achieving what I set out to achieve.
So when did that shift and how?
It wasn't something that I consciously did. When I started working in cafes, actually baking for a living, there was just slowly, like very fractionally every day, less and less room in my head for my brain to like obsess over the eating disorder, because I was discovering this other thing that, you know, you'd show up to work and there'd be a prep list of, you know, I have to make these 20 things by the end of the day and I've got 9 hours to do it and I have to be efficient. And so my brain had to start focusing on achieving that prep list.
And could it when it had no fuel?
Yeah. I could probably go back and ask people that I worked with early on. And I mean, I know this has been spoken about as well, but now like just one of the most important people in my recovery process. When I stopped working at that bakery that I got a job at when I first came back, there was this little cafe around the corner from mum and dad's house. And on my days off, I'd walk around there and get my coffee in the morning. And it was just perfection. Like we're just around the corner from Flower and Stone now. And there are, not in the exact appearance, but the feeling you get when you walk into Flower and Stone, you feel like you've walked into...
Flower and Stone is a little bakery just near where the Mamma Mia office is in Woolloomooloo, yeah?
Yeah, and Nadine's created this environment. You feel like you're walking into a place in her heart when you walk into that cafe.
That's a beautiful way of putting it.
Yeah, and everything that she does isn't... it is made with science, but it's more made with love.
Yeah.
And when you eat it, you sense the love that's gone into it, and you're eating it in this environment that just makes you feel genuinely happy. And this was what that little cafe was like. And I drummed up the courage one day to ask the owner if I could have a job working for her and if I could do the baked goods for her. And she said yes.
Why did she say yes?
She revealed to me a lot later that she recognised the eating disorder in me and she wanted to give me a supportive environment.
It's very counterintuitive. She must have known a thing or two, because to think that an anorexic would thrive in an environment where they were baking things, that's a lot of trust. Yeah. Makes me hungry for a croissant, you know? And that's not even the end of my conversation with Kate. I hope you enjoyed this first episode. On the subscriber episode, which you can listen to right now, we chat about how Kate exactly recovered from the eating disorder that almost took her life. What were those points along the way that made her realise, hey, I am actually getting better? There's a link in the show notes. And we'll also put a link to the Butterfly Foundation if listening to Kate's story has made you feel like it might be time to reach out for some help. The producer of No Filter is Emmeline Peterson. Our executive producer is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Madeline Juano. I'm Mia Freedman. Thanks for having me in your ears.